Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing our piecewise defined function activity. In today's, we're going to be talking about actually how to graph a full piecewise function. In class yesterday, you can tell that we talked about basically how to graph one of these lines on a graph with a restriction. Okay, we talked about these two problems here, where if I'm given either of these and I want to graph a value that is restricted. So, for example, over here on the left-hand side here, we have over here on the left-hand side, we have the values from 0 to -3 because we want to graph only the numbers on the left of the graph. On the other side, this right-hand side over here, we ask you to graph only the numbers that are on the right of it. And when we do this, it restricts how the line looks. For example, if I show the answers here, if you notice, each line kind of has its own restriction based on those numbers. Okay. On the left or this right-hand side here, only graphed is everything above 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3. Over on the left-hand side here is everything graphed, everything below 0. So 0, -1, -2, -3. Okay. And that's kind of the main thing you want to focus on going to start. Okay. Now, in today's lesson, we're going to go a little bit more in depth. We're going to try to do multiple values of these on the same line. Okay. So our goal is basically going to be to get graphs similar to this, where I take that idea of basically saying, okay, if I wanted to cut off and graph two different graphs along this line or break it down through that, notice how on each of these I have my own line segment, okay? To the right-hand side, I get this line. To the left-hand side, I get this line. So I get two different lines on the same graph. Now, it looks funky because there's two different lines connected to one another, but basically that's like saying we have this equation and this equation being used in this same problem, okay? So let's actually talk about how we would do this. If I look at the example for number 5 here, complete the table of values, then graph the function. What they're doing right now is they're giving us two different functions, kind of like a system, right? So if I look here, they're actually giving me a system of equations, okay? Now, here's all I want to think about, okay? You have two graphs and they tell you this particular information right here, okay? This is called your restriction, okay? It's telling you where on the graph you're going to split this up. So notice how I have a -1 on top and bottom. Well, that should be an automatic indicator of where you're actually going to have to break up your line. So what we do is we actually create something called a fence, which basically means is I want to go to -1 on the, the coordinate plane here, and just draw a dotted line through there. This is going to indicate that there are going to be graphs on the right-hand side and the left-hand side of this graph. Okay? We're going to have two separate lines. So I basically want to think of everything that's going to be in this area is going to be its own graph, and everything that's going to be in this area is going to be its own graph. Okay? Next, let's talk about how we actually want to solve this. Well, now we want to read into what these actual values are telling us. Okay? Well, this first one is saying x is less than -1. So that basically means I want to graph everything that is less than -1, right? Which means I want to graph -1, -2, -3, -4, and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this graph over here to the left, and I'm going to write this equation on top of it. -2x minus 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to draw a line right at -1. I don't care about these three values down here. All I care is from -1 and up. Or technically -1 and down, right? Because we're going lower. But then also what I want to do is I want to get a second equation. This x plus 3 I also need to graph. And the chart I want to make for this one is basically going from -1 and up. Okay? So if you notice, look how I'm creating two graphs. Each of them have a starting and an ending point. This one ends at -1. This one starts at -1. The only difference is based on the knowledge we're given up here, this top equation has to be greater than -1, less than -1, based on what the restriction told me. While The bottom equation, x plus 3, needs to be greater than -1. So by looking at those two values, I know that this chart over here to the right are all my values greater than. The chart to the left are all my values less than. So with that knowledge, let's start to graph this out. Well, if I start plugging these values in, if I plug -4 into that equation, this would give me -2 times -4 minus 2. That will come out to be +8 minus 2, or an answer of 6. Continue on, this would be -2 times -3 minus 2. -2 times -3 would be +6, minus 2 would give me 4. And then I would just continue this pattern of just plugging that value in for x and getting an answer until I get down to the last one. This would be 2, this would be 0. So now what I actually have here are 4 different coordinates. I have the coordinate -4, 6, -3, 4, -2, 2, and -1, 0. And with those 4 coordinates, I can actually graph this equation out. Well, this would be at -4, we'd have a +6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At -3, we'd have +4. At -2, we'd have +2. And at -1, we'd have a coordinate at 0. Okay? But since I'm touching that fence, I'm going to go ahead and just put an open circle there for now, and we'll kind of talk about why that is later. But as you can see now, see how I reached my fence? That little dotted line I did at the beginning? Well, now all I have to do is draw my line segment, and I have my first graph. This one is everything to the left of -1. I don't cross that fenced area. I reach it, but I never actually pass through it. And I have my first graph drawn. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for the second graph. We have an x plus 3, and we're going to plug these values in. So same thing, we plug -1 in for x. -1 plus 3 would give me 2. 0 plus 3 would give me 3. And then 1 plus 3 would give me 4. 2 plus 3 would give me 5. So same thing, as you can kind of notice, these all give me coordinates. At -1, I have 2. At 0, 3, 1, 4, 2, 5. So let's go ahead and plot these out. At -1, we have an answer of 2. At 0, we have 3. 1, 2, 3. At 1, we have 4. And at 2, we have 5. And from there, I can connect the dots to get my second graph. Okay? Now, at this point, you kind of can see how I have a graph on each side of this fence. Each one has a point that gets to the fence, but it never actually crosses it. It stops once it reaches that point. Okay? So the key thing I want us to understand is that really all we're doing is graphing 2 different lines. Okay, that's really all we're doing. We're graphing one line on the left and line on the right. The difference now is that I'm just picking a spot where I'm basically saying, hey, restrict it here. Only graph the left side of this graph and the right side of this graph. Okay? The last thing we're going to talk about is what does these actual dots on the line mean? Well, this goes back all the way to this original restriction and what these 2 inequalities are telling me. All right? Well, we want to understand what they're actually saying. Well, this top one is basically saying x is less than -1. It never says it's equal to it. It only says it's less than it. So if I go down to here and notice, look how I did an open dot. Well, open dot means it cannot equal that value. So this is representing what this inequality up here is telling me. While if I think about the other one, if I go and think about the other inequality, that's greater than or equal to. So how I represent that restriction is that instead of doing an open dot, I do a closed dot, because that's telling me that I can equal that value. So notice how the only difference between the 2 lines in that the fact that I'm graphing just using a chart and things like that is that for this particular one, I have to just plot a closed circle because it can equal. Okay? And what we've done here is graphed our first piecewise function. Now, as we move forward, we'll be talking about more of these, basically how to solve out and actually work through them. But this is kind of the early steps for this, okay? With that being said, that's kind of the end of today's video. Hopefully, kept it pretty short for you, just so you can kind of understand it. We'll be going over the rest of this in class tomorrow. Please answer the questions and have a great day.